Across the Sun by Jason Pagano and Bill Robinson. Prologue. He woke warily, brushing the hair from his eyes. The campfire was out, but the coals were still hot. He threw a log on the coals and watched as the fire returned to life. Then he pulled his blade from its scabbard and admired how its intricate gold inlay complemented the crimson gems set into the pommel. He also grabbed his shield, the design of which mirrored his weapon. Realizing everyone in the camp was still asleep, a feeling of duty overtook him. His friends, his family, they needed his protection. He went to sit on a nearby rock, which gave him a clear view of his sleeping companions. In the distance, an orange light streaked across the morning sky. Its tail glittered yellow and red, like sparks falling away from a blacksmith's grinding stone. At the edge of camp stood a woman, whose scarlet silk robe fell gracefully over her feminine figure. Her crimson hair shone as the sun rose over the horizon. She appeared ageless, even timeless. Her beauty was divine. She was somehow familiar to him. She was watching him, but he couldn't comprehend the meaning in her gaze. He wanted to know more about her. From the forest behind her, a cloud of black swirled up. Her eyes locked with his as the cloud billowed around her. But she didn't move. She didn't run. Panic welled up in his chest. His throat tightened as he tried to get to his feet. He wanted to run to her, to save her, but couldn't move. There was something holding him back. Just as the cloud overtook her, she spoke a name.
Catalan.
The cloud dissipated. He looked back to his companions, lying just as they had before, except now their lifeless bodies were covered in blood. Part 1, Chapter 1, Baking Bread. Saba awoke and sat upright so calmly as though she lay down and closed her eyes, but in reverse. She'd fallen asleep again on the couch beneath the window overlooking the backyard. Off in the distance, a few bats were canvassing in one final lap before the sunlight sent them to rest. Her dwarven knees ached as she stood to investigate the faint sound of footsteps.
That boy,
she sighed as she reached for her robe. Approaching from the garden, Aeden quietly entered the kitchen through the back door and dropped on the ground a bag from which flour billowed into the air, covering his blonde, unkempt hair and his skin, deeply tanned from a season of working outdoors. He let out a large yawn as he went to the sink and began cleaning last night's dishes.
the nightmare again?
Saba asked as she approached him. She noticed the half-dozen fresh loaves of bread and the last of the flour in the corner.
Go lay down.
She commanded gently.
But what about Professor Gorram?
Aeden was the only one of their children insistent on using honorifics for his parents.
Never you mind about him. I'll take care of those dishes for you. You just get your rest. You have a long day ahead of you.
She collected the drying rag from his large hands. Aeden shuffled out of the kitchen and went upstairs. Saba wondered when, in the middle of the night, he'd snuck outside. Just past the kitchen screen door were the stairs to the dormitory. Fatigued, Aeden considered how climbing these creaky stairs might wake his siblings. Closing the door inside the loft, he thought to remove his boots only after collapsing into bed. Reaching for his laces, he realized he made dozens of loaves of bread in the middle of the night while barefoot.
Hi, Rook.
Aeden mumbled after closing his eyes. It surprised Ruccharieu, his clearly exhausted human brother, thought to greet him. As an elf, he was the only one upstairs who'd likely be aware of Aeden's return. Elves had no physiological need to sleep, but would meditate for long stretches of time. He had mentioned once that others would be unnerved should they wake in the middle of the night and see him staring vacantly ahead, so he'd committed to closing his eyes in a semblance of solidarity. Ruccharieu grinned as he considered responding, but noticed Aeden had already fallen asleep. Chapter 2, Water and Fire. Gathering for breakfast was unremarkable, save for Aeden's absence. The siblings had seen him sprawled on his bed as they descended the sliding pole, so they knew he had a troublesome night. Each also assumed their mother already knew this and had probably spoken a word with their father about it before they'd convened around the table. Saba said,
Your brother had a rough night again. He'll be down later. Save him a few bites, would you?
Yesterday afternoon, Gorram had demonstrated Create Flame, a simple arcane incantation during class in the backyard. In his palm, he'd created a pocket of intense heat that could even ignite a small flame within itself, if one desired. Niwa, with her gnomish curiosity and feistiness, had found this spell particularly interesting. The quick flash of fire that had sprung from her father's dwarven palm twinkled in her bright eyes. She wasn't always the most attentive student, but when the magic suited her personality, she'd fixate on a spell until it was second nature. After practicing into the evening, Niwa had delighted in showcasing her new skill by cooking popping corn from her hand. She'd scurried all about the house, seeking out her siblings to show them her new trick. She was again popping kernels at the table during breakfast as Gorram lectured them about a discipline he called forbearance. One of his favorite themes was teaching his children about appropriate and inappropriate situations regarding the use of magic.
Arcana is appropriate as self-defense,
Their father said.
but should always be used sparingly where it is not embraced by the community. It should go without saying that arcana is the only type of magic to be practiced at all.
Gorram glanced to Aeden's empty chair. It had been months since he'd caught his human son practicing his strange magical ability. The siblings avoided making eye contact with Gorram as he lectured. At home, he often used magic and arcana interchangeably. But he dodged any discussion of other types of magic, so they remained just figments of their thriving imaginations. The only community the siblings knew was the nearby village of Raven's Cross. Everywhere else beyond their ancient homestead seemed to be woods or valley. Essentially, their father was reminding them never to use magic during their weekly errands in town. The people of Raven's Cross regarded Gorram as an eccentric farmer who took in strays and lived in some sort of hermitage with strange children. Rumors had been circulating for years that Gorram and his brood of teenagers used magic.
Forbearance,
The dwarf continued.
is about finding diversions in everyday activities that centers us when we're provoked and empowers us with self-control.
Everyone was half listening and half focused on eating. Gorram looked to Kliyd. He was pleased she, the youngest of his children, seemed most attentive to his lecture. In actuality, the child was staring at a chunk of food that rolled out of his mouth as he talked, only to lodge in his dense goatee. Would it simply fall out on its own, or would someone comment on it? That someone certainly wouldn't be her, she decided. Ruccharieu had stood to give himself better leverage as he sliced another loaf of Aeden's bread. As he considered himself an obedient student, he'd convinced himself this lecture was probably meant for his sisters. After all, he agreed with most of Gorham's treatises on arcane etiquette, and he already felt educated in this curriculum. Slicing bread was just something to do. He heard Saba mutter to herself.
I think he left the door open last night. Something is off.
Gorram leaned forward to serve himself another slice of buttered bread as a lone kernel sailed from Niwa's petite hand right into Gorham's open mouth. He jerked up and out of his seat and began coughing. His father's sudden movements surprised Ruccharieu, who stepped back, crashing into his chair. As he and the chair slid backwards, everyone heard a tiny but blood-curdling screech from beneath the table. Klyd's eyes widened in horror. The young Tikas girl hopped off her seat and ran to the other side of the table. Ruccharieu sat motionless, only vaguely understanding the noise had come from somewhere close to him. Kliyd dove beneath her brother's chair, her prehensile tail tucked between her legs in distress, then resurfaced holding an injured animal to her chest.
Is that a raccoon?
Ruccharieu asked in a low voice.
No,
Kliyd answered.
it's a cockamissile.
A what?
Niwa thought she'd misheard. Though she'd never admit it, she did briefly think her sister might share some distant ancestry with that creature. The Tikas race appeared a mix of small humans and rats, so the idea wasn't far-fetched. Usually Gorram had ample patience for raising his brood of teenagers. This morning, however, was testing his patience. Furthermore, he was vexed by Aeden, who had been up most of the night again because of some reoccurring nightmare, and was now sleeping through family time.
This could be our last breakfast together on this world, and still, it's fraught with chaos.
Gorram lamented. his eyes clenched shut in frustration.
Take that thing outside, Kliyd.
He sat in silence so his ominous words would linger in the air, despite an unintentional rhyme undermining his tone. Everyone observed him in silence and surprise, since they knew he didn't enjoy administering discipline by yelling. The irony of his frustration directly after his speech about forbearance, however, seemed lost on him. Kliyd scampered out of the dining room, through the kitchen, and out the back door, still holding the injured creature close to her body. Saba was not one to indulge in drama. She smiled casually.
Well, I'm glad to see my children are making new friends.
She glanced at the screen door. It was once again slightly ajar. With a few strained chuckles, they resumed eating breakfast. Gorram leaned back, appearing less tense. He hoped that had been the last of the antics. From where he sat, Ruccharieu could see out the kitchen window. He hoped to spy Kliyd veering off towards the pond. He assumed correctly and saw the Tika start into the woods. Politely excusing himself, Ruccharieu collected his plate along with several others and brought them to the kitchen sink. He felt a little guilty leaving Niwa alone with Gorram and Saba, especially considering her role in the brief bedlam as he quietly exited the back door. The night before, he too had practiced the spell Gorram had taught them. The young mage had spent hours working to reverse engineer the base arcana of the spell. Instead of creating a pocket of intense heat, he'd manifested a pocket of intense, cold moisture. The elf picked up a pebble, gripping it in his palm. Concentrating, he manipulated Create Flame to chill the very air itself, and soon a walnut-sized ball of ice encapsulated the pebble. The young mage threw the ice ball, successfully hitting the dormitory door with a faint thump. Satisfied, he turned to go rendezvous with his sister. Past the footpath to a river bend, Kliyd cradled the animal as she climbed a cedar tree. A halfling bounded toward her, moving along the tree boughs until he was squatting by her feet. The Tika stared at his sage-colored dungaree vest and his hairy bare feet as he smiled reassuringly at her and the animal.
I know it be an accident, but the impact done a real number on her rear leg,
said the halfling, who resembled an adult human at half the size. His voice was pleasant and mellow.
That's dislocated. You need to set it back in place, understand? It's gonna hurt bad for it helps her. Glad to see you done stop the bleeding.
The halfling gritted his teeth and, gesturing, supervised Kliyd as she reset the bone. She cringed in sympathy, briefly looking away and closing her eyes. When she reopened them, she was alone once again with the rescued animal. Kliyd never wondered why the friendliest strangers appeared out of nowhere to speak with her, but this only happened when she was alone, so she never told another soul about them, lest they disbelieve her or think her bizarre. A heartbeat later, Kliyd whistled below to Ruccharieu, who appeared to be looking for her. The elf grinned and looked up, locating his sister almost at once.
How's the patient?
She nodded to suggest a good prognosis and began to climb down the cedar tree. Ruccharieu nodded back, impressed with his sister. He hadn't been sure what treatment the injured animal had needed, so the mage had secretly called for an animal rescue of his own. He thought to bide some time until that aid arrived.
Think I can beat my personal best?
Kliyd stopped a few boughs down from her previous perch, feeling in slightly better spirits.
From 10. Get ready.
As his sister counted down, Ruccharieu hurriedly removed his vest, pants, and shoes. For a teenager who kept his nose in the books, his physique was remarkable. Like all elves, he had dark amber skin and a willowy frame. But his labor-intensive chores and his dedication to swimming and diving accounted for his toned body. At the count of 2, Ruccharieu was standing in the river, which rose to his chest. At 1, he inhaled deeply and squatted down so his eyes and ears were just above the water margin.
Go.
Ruccharieu folded his legs into the lotus position and sat submerged in the river. He loved the silence. He loved the pressure of the water against his body, to feel enveloped in its embrace. It felt like learning he could find magnetic north instinctively. Kliyd began to worry after she'd mentally counted to 200. Her brother had been underwater for over 3 minutes. She considered if her brother had fallen unconscious, he'd be carried out with the river's moderate current. He remained poised in his spot. The Tikas continued her count as the cockamissile nestled in her lap and closed her eyes. Ruccharieu resurfaced almost casually as Kliyd announced.
346.
He grinned, knowing full well this wasn't his personal best. It had been, however, enough time for his animal rescuer to arrive. Aeden was walking toward them. He raised a hand in greeting.
I got your hail. Was it supposed to be a play on words?
Pretty clever, Rook.
Actually, that was just a happy accident.
The elf replied, smiling. Kliyd descended the tree with a small patient, so Aeden could see the animal's injury. His brother, somehow already dry, was getting dressed, and he nodded in silent agreement to Aeden.
This animal is called a cockamissile. Is that right?
Ruccharieu was standing at the river and letting the cool water roll over his feet. Aeden held the injured animal. A small flame appeared to be escaping from his hands, but it emanated no crackling nor produced any ash. The animal remained submissive and still. Within seconds, the grayish-white flames went up her maimed leg without burning her. The gash on her foot was gone. He set the animal down, and she scrambled back up the tree. No trace of injury remained.
Someday I hope to better understand how your magic is different. Sure, it isn't arcana, but Gorram has never been straightforward about why he seems to abhor it so much.
Ruccharieu said.
It just means I teach myself and never tell him about it.
Aeden said forlornly, extending an arm to hug his sister.
I'm almost positive Miss Saba knows I still practice.
Kliyd was uncomfortable with anyone touching her, but understood familial touch was a sort of healing for her brother, who nursed feelings of rejection, so she leaned into the hug. She also nodded at his suspicion that Saba knew more than she mentioned. Aeden had always been drawn to the flame, its warmth, its light. Often, he'd find himself staring into the chimenea as his bread was baking, the fire's heat making his creations rise.
Let's get back,
suggested Ruccharieu.
No one wants to get in trouble on his last day in the world.
He was lightly mocking Gorham's turn of phrase. Aeden raised his eyebrows, not understanding Ruccharieu's word choice. Kliyd scurried forward and led them all back to the house. Chapter 3. Silence.
To study one's reflection is to look backwards in the present.
Niwa had recalled this traditional gnome proverb for as long as she could remember, but never knew when she'd first heard it. That morning, Gorram was teaching his children about stillness and meditation. Niwa was restless throughout the session, but had resolved never to let a fiasco like yesterday's breakfast repeat itself. Was her restlessness due to having to focus on stillness, or was Gorram teaching her about stillness because she was so rambunctious? Their father was also encouraging them to practice the arcane art of silence. When cast properly, the magic user commanded a sphere around herself through which no sound waves could penetrate. The caster, of course, would also be silent within the spell. After Gorham's lesson, Niwa went into the dining room, an eternal hub of commotion, and sat at the table. Closing her eyes, she ceased fidgeting and then imagined time stopping. She imagined everyone halting and seeing her meditating. They'd be slack-jawed, immobilized by her talent and discipline. The image of her marveling family served as the focus for her new spell. Niwa practiced silence all afternoon. She practiced by the stream, denying even the gentle sound of the flowing water and the bugs darting around her. Birds were unaffected by her sphere of quietude, but their song couldn't reach within it. She practiced near Aeden, who was cutting wheat with a scythe and making labored grunting sounds. At first, the hush intrigued him, but soon he became irritated by it, and he shooed his sister away. A few hours passed before she opened her eyes to discover it was dark outside. Images of gnomes appeared as she'd meditated. Some of them had seemed to speak to her, though none used any words. She wished she could have heard what these fascinating strangers were trying to say to her. She also would have liked to hear anyone calling out time for dinner, but these things couldn't happen within the arcane silence. Dreamily, she wandered back home, passing by the pond. She was thinking about the gnomes she'd seen during meditation, wondering how she could visualize her kind so clearly. She'd never seen another gnome in the flesh before. Under the light of a waxing moon, she paused and saw her reflection in the still water. Over her left shoulder was the moon's reflection. Over her right was a ghostly gnome with hair even wilder than her own.
Your ancestor, Leo Jowry, couldn't sit still in class either. He still became a skilled summoner,
the man said. He continued discussing gnomes of a bygone era. Niwa was fascinated. Somehow, she understood his usage of a clan surname before her ancestor's name. The gnomish history sheltered her in a way that was both familiar and unfamiliar at the same time. Each story was brief. Each was a thread woven into a tapestry. She felt a strong affinity with the Liu clan. Then she heard a familiar voice.
Niwa, I managed to save your dinner before Rook or Aeden could get their mitts on it.
Saba, approaching her daughter, wondered why Niwa was staring at the water.
I might not be able to rescue it a second time, so let's head back now, all right?
The girl sprang to her feet, turning to face her mother. She decided to keep communing with ancestors to herself for now, at least.
I think magic can work sometimes without practice casting.
Niwa said as they walked home. For the first time that night, she noticed the ambient sounds of crickets all around them.
What makes you say that?
Asked Saba. She was pleased her child was making this connection.
I think
Her daughter hesitated.
once you awaken to the idea of arcana happening around you, sometimes you can just see and hear it if you know how to look and listen.
Has anyone ever told you that gnomes are descended from the Fae?
Saba looked up at the moon as they walked.
Rook told me that once from a book he was reading.
She bluffed. Their home was so far removed from most people. Niwa wondered why her mother thought someone might have told her something like that. And yet she still wanted her mother to see her as knowledgeable.
Some disagree with me, but I think magic comes from other worlds.
Saba said.
What is natural in one world is magic in another. You start to see things differently once you travel a bit.
Can you tell me more about the Fae?
The term sounded familiar to her, like another proverb she couldn't place.
The Fae travel all the time. All of them, fairies, pixies, yachts, leprechauns, learn their talents along the way. Some have remained in this world over countless lifetimes. Gnomes are descended from them. Gnomes are handy with magic, yet native to this world.
Saba removed a leaf that had gotten stuck in her daughter's wild hair.
Have you met any of these creatures?
She wondered if she might be able to see them beside her reflection, and tried to imagine what they looked like. Saba closed her eyes and slowly moved her head as though trying to pinpoint a far-off sound or smell.
Some of them live among nature. I don't know any, but I believe what you said about arcana. The gnomes were once Fae, but not all Fae are gnomes. Both exist and can live in the same world. So why should all magic work the same way? Some magic is not arcana.
Niwa opened the kitchen door for her mother, then followed her inside. Her meal was waiting for her at the table, but everyone had retired for the night. That line about rescuing her dinner from her brothers had been a loving exaggeration. The two hugged and wished each other a good night. Then Niwa, after casting Create Flame so she could enjoy her meal by candlelight, ate her dinner in real silence. Niwa recalled the proverb,
To study one's reflection is to look backwards in the present.
and thought she understood its meaning. She could look to her ancestors' spirits by literally seeing them backwards, in the light of a reflection. Before heading into the dormitory, Niwa climbed the stairs railing to get on the roof. Using a hand mirror to reflect the moonlight, she was eager to continue listening to her people. She wanted to learn from them the way tribes learn their culture around the campfire. Most of all, she wanted to meet and talk to more people. Kliyd heard the faint noises overhead. Far and away, the stealthiest sibling, the Tikas climbed out a dormitory window and onto the roof, then sauntered up behind the preoccupied Niwa. While she couldn't see the gnome spirit relatives, she listened to her sister without interrupting. Niwa, shifting her hand mirror, suddenly noticed her sister behind her. Startled, she tossed the mirror, which Kliyd deftly caught before it could shatter on the rooftop. Her sister withdrew apologetically.
Seeing through time is seeing the fourth dimension.
Kliyd said quietly, her eyes unusually bright.
Please continue.
Niwa smiled at the tenderness of her sister's words. Kliyd was not only stealthy, but laconic. Sometimes, when she did speak, her words seemed profound, as if she were borrowing wisdom beyond her years. The older sister loved sharing this experience with Kliyd. Her new secret was already gone, but soon the voices of her past would have opportunities to share secrets of their own. Chapter 4. Klyd's Training. Even though her leg muscles burned from repeatedly dodging and tumbling, Kliyd never took her eyes off her opponent's hands. The orc towered over her, and yet every bash and thrust of his mace came at her impossibly quickly. Watch those hands, she thought, for they moved the weapon. It seemed unfair that such a large foe could strike so deftly. Tikas had the agility of their rat ancestors, scaled to a bipedal frame, but were about a third the size of the brutish orc. The duel lasted for over 5 minutes, which was a long time to parry and dodge and survive. The orc was not remotely exhausted, so she needed to move decisively. Kliyd leapt up, narrowly dodging the vicious mace. Using the orc's extended arm as a springboard, she leapt again, straight up. Her dagger, sized for humans or elves, was effectively a short sword in her hands. Her blade met the orc's throat, penetrating it and emerging out the other side. Kliyd somersaulted off the stunned orc's chest while wrapping her tail around the dagger's hilt, violently pulling the dagger from the orc's neck. Her opponent stopped moving. She had likely severed his spinal column, ending all motor function. In a flash, the uncanny image of the orc imploded into nothingness. Gorram's spell had ceased. These training sessions were very important to their father. Most days, Gorram marched his children outside for lessons involving arcana. There had been a time when he tried to teach all his children to use magic the same way, but he'd changed his teaching style as their strengths and talents had become clear. With Ruccharieu and Niwa, he taught them arcana in practice, allowing them to mimic his words and the movements until they became second nature. But with Aeden and Kliyd, he threw arcana at them, allowing them to train martially. If their father was disappointed these two showed little interest in casting spells of their own, he didn't let it show.
Well done,
Gorram said. Kliyd nodded, retrieving her dagger with her tail. She didn't explain to Gorram that such a creature wouldn't be able to strike repeatedly with such speed. And she didn't care to admit she'd felt physically threatened by a phantom who couldn't actually hurt her. As was typical, she kept her thoughts to herself. The Tikas dropped to all fours and traipsed back to the dormitory. One of her legs was bothering her, and taking some of the pressure off it was worth any embarrassment in front of her family. Kliyd knew her siblings thought she was somewhat strange. At least, she thought she knew that. The people of Ravenscross surely thought she was strange. Their faces conveyed a lack of understanding. Maybe they thought she was the pet traveling with the family.
That girl's an animal slinking away like that.
She imagined someone saying,
"What a weird girl. She never wears shoes either,"
commented no one. Kliyd didn't realize she struggled to interpret nonverbal cues. Sometimes social situations would make her self-conscious, although she knew she possessed unique skills. When townsfolk stared, she stared back until someone flinched. Her siblings wanted her to talk more, but she rarely did. She didn't feel the need to explain her thoughts and feelings. She couldn't explain colorblindness, for example, if the colors she saw had always appeared normal to her. She defeated Arcana today, she thought. It was strong, but she had stabbed it right in the throat. The thought sounded to her as though it were a maxim. She often reflected on Arcana, and on many occasions felt she inherently didn't trust it. Magic had to come from a source, and those who invoked it were guilty of stealing that which didn't belong to them. As she retired to bed early, foregoing dinner and resting her muscles, these thoughts reverberated in her mind.
Well, Kliyd, on behalf of my people, I appreciate that the orcs you choose to murder are illusions.
In another dormitory bed lay a gnome with tousled blonde hair and square-framed glasses who resembled Niwa. Kliyd blinked at the friendly stranger before she jumped into her own bed. As the beds were sized for larger folk, the Tikas needed to launch herself upwards.
If you didn't fully scratch your killer itch today, I saw some real hobgoblins yesterday. Talk about savage. They're out fiddling in the woods past the pond. I don't know what they were looking for, but I hope it was food. They're practically stick people.
The teenage girl continued as she examined her gnomish fingers. Kliyd stretched and yawned. She wondered how this person knew her name. She also didn't know what the girl was talking about.
Still and all, I just felt different today, I guess.
The girl said.
One thing I'll say about being a gnome. This bed feels huge. I still like sleeping outside better, though. That sounds weird, doesn't it?
The Tikas shook her head as her eyes grew heavy. It must have been another hallucination, she thought. When she reopened her eyes following a hearty yawn, the gnome was gone. She'd ponder this tomorrow. So we're all weird here, she mused. We're supposed to be here. Chapter 5, Losing the Trail.
Something is different about the trail,
Saba said. Standing outside and looking toward the horizon, she was idly tossing an empty glass bottle, letting it spin several times over before catching it.
Everything changes in due time,
quipped Gorram.
Would you care to elaborate?
I see you getting lost on the way to town. And I realize that sounds absurd, considering you travel that trail all the time.
Gorram tipped his head as he read her face as a puppy might to a command he couldn't fully understand. He grinned.
Well, I guess I'll look forward to it.
Saba showed no emotion, refusing to feel discouraged that he'd dismissed her ability. She'd always trusted her sixth sense as he trusted arcana.
It's been nearly 20 years since we intervened. I doubt the hobgoblins even think we came back to this world.
Gorram was hoping to assuage her concerns. He still quickly glanced about to ensure their children were out of earshot.
Intervene is a diplomatic word for what happened.
She sighed softly.
I just don't want to leave yet. This is the only home they've ever known.
She hadn't needed to mention hobgoblins, which had dominated their concerns for years.
We both agreed it would have been dangerous if he'd stayed with his kind,
Gorram said.
They wouldn't have raised such a troubled child. They'd probably have killed him.
He has a name, and we couldn't raise Gusk either. But I wasn't talking about him when I mentioned the trail. Not a day goes by when I don't think about what happened to him and second-guess our decisions.
I know,
Gorram said.
I think about him too. We can go back there soon, I promise. But the children aren't old enough yet.
He heard someone landing downstairs via the sliding pole, and so ended the conversation. They held hands for a moment. He understood her fear that even a trip into town for supplies could expose them to danger. Gorram closed his eyes as the kitchen door swatted shut and paged his children.
In the cart, you louts!
He had a special way of being affectionate. Ruccharieu went to the cart promptly and began reading a novel he'd acquired from town. He had a small collection, all of which he'd read dozens of times. Already, he'd stacked the assorted breads in crates at the front of the cart. Through the dormitory door, Niwa bounded out, ready to take on the world. The door nearly shut on Aeden, who dragged himself outside looking exhausted from another night of fitful sleep. The old dwarf carefully mounted his faithful mule, Skunk, and guided him to the spring cart. With gentle eyes, he appraised his crew as he went to the hitch assembly. 3 siblings were sitting in the cart, waiting patiently. Gorram sighed loudly, closed his eyes, and prepared to holler once more for Kliyd to get in the cart. As he inhaled, he heard a clicking sound behind him. He turned from his saddle, noticing Skunk was now hitched to the cart. He looked up, bewildered, and saw all 4 of his children.
My children aren't armed for war, correct?
Gorram asked. He focused on Kliyd, but faced forward again before anyone could reply. The siblings dismissed their father's comment as a small joke and replied with indistinct noises of agreement. The rule was no one brought their training weapons into town, because doing so would only lead to bad consequences. Kliyd wondered if her father was giving himself plausible deniability. She'd become skilled at hiding her dagger beneath her oversized shirt and retrieving it with her tail.
When we get to Raven's Cross, I do hope you all will have decided in advance what you'd like for breakfast. We learned last time that they don't serve, at the General.
You mean brunch?
Replied Niwa.
I mean what?
Gorram scratched his goatee.
It's not breakfast and it's not lunch. It's brunch,
she explained.
I suppose we never stop learning new things,
Gorram said. He stroked Skunk's head while whispering some arcane words. A mysterious wind blew Skunk's mane and tail forward as a tailwind spell started the mule off on a spirited trot. The cart rolled forward easily. Aeden glanced over Ruccharieu's shoulder.
What is it this week? Let me guess. Arcane aura, enchanted elves, shining swords.
The elf did not put down his copy of Thief in the Night, but looked at his brother.
That's a lot of alliteration, Aeden.
He smiled. The cart hit a rut that shook all its occupants and made the bread crates wobble.
Aeden, get on the other side,
Gorram called.
Make yourself useful as ballast, would you?
Niwa chuckled and patted the space next to her and Kliyd, who, at best, occupied the space of human children.
Gorram, tell us more about other worlds,
the gnome said, hugging her knees in expectation of a good story.
Very well. Imagine it's noon and the sun is at its highest in the vast sky above. You jump to try to reach the sun. Of course, you don't reach it. And we all know why.
Gravity.
Niwa answered with satisfaction.
Correct. If you could jump directly to the sun, then you'd leave our atmosphere and later get pulled into the sun's gravity instead. Of course, you'd die in space first, but that's not the point.
Either that, or the sun itself would dispatch you,
Ruccharieu said. Gorram chortled.
Now imagine the sun is just an illusion. If you could look up at it and jump very, very high, so high that you would pass right through the sun, where would you land?
Aeden asked warily.
Are you telling us the sun is an illusion, Professor?
Gorram asked again.
Where would you land, my son?
Skunk's hooves clomped along as though he were keeping time.
Another world?
Aeden finally answered, feeling unsure. Gorram turned to nod affirmatively.
Aeden, the sun is very real, but the space between worlds is like the oceans between land. We can't just jump over with our own 2 legs.
Ruccharieu thought of the pleasant imagery he associated with the word oceans. Absently, he blurted out.
Arcana.
Gorram hesitated.
Arcana is the means for traveling to the worlds, yes. Was that what you meant, Rook?
I assume all worlds are essentially made from arcana as well.
Arcana is only the means. It isn't responsible for creating and destroying worlds.
Gorham's voice had grown stern.
Something destroys worlds?
Niwa asked. Skunk snorted, halting in his tracks.
Where are we?
Aeden grabbed the small shovel he occasionally used to dig a wheel from the mud. He stood up to survey the area. The woods were eerily quiet. Gorram suspected some rangers had modified this area to confuse travelers.
Any wayward rogue who manipulates nature won't be worthy of my pity,
he warned loudly. After a few tense seconds, he began to say some arcane words.
Stop,
Kliyd said quietly. The Tikas had thus far been silent, watching their surroundings like a sentinel. Their father ceased his spell and looked over at her. Ruccharieu and Niwa also held off preparing spells. Everyone watched as Kliyd stood, turning slowly to follow something or someone in the woods. She appeared calm and collected. Finally, the family heard 2 creatures scurrying away, small branches snapping underfoot.
We have nothing of value. They checked,
Kliyd explained, sitting again. It was true. The cart was empty of any material goods save for the breads. Gorram let out a soft grunt.
Thank you, my dear.
Why did you stop, Professor Gorram?
Aeden hesitated to sit down, but finally put aside the shovel and sat.
I think,
Niwa said,
if whoever was watching us saw Gorram using arcana, they'd have a reason to investigate further.
Very much,
said Ruccharieu.
The hobgoblins headed towards town, northeast.
Kliyd looked off in that general direction. The strange girl from her hallucination had mentioned hobgoblins in the nearby woods. Her even tone didn't betray she was only guessing.
What?
Gorram said. He was certain his children hadn't heard him discussing hobgoblins with Saba.
You mean from training?
Asked Niwa, mistaken. She was eagerly trying to glimpse the mysterious fleeing figures.
No, those were orcs. But what is it about the hobgoblins?
Ruccharieu asked. It seemed wildly coincidental he'd just been reading about villainous hobgoblin thieves a few moments ago. His father looked more nervous now than he had with the threat of an ambush.
Ah, northeast. Thank you, my dear. You saved me the effort of another spell,
Gorram said, hoping his easygoing smile would dismiss his children's concerns. He kicked Skunk to go forward. The dwarf tried to remain upbeat, but said nothing more about the matter. On the next episode, the siblings and their father Gorram journey to the village of Raven's Cross. But do the locals find them suspicious?
I've heard about your magic. You call it something else, something pretentious. I'm sure you teach it to all your foster children.
Suddenly, Gorram is defending their blended family.
I teach my children many things, as a good parent does. We call it arcana.
Are they all hiding some mysterious magic?
You can't do anything.
I don't play God.
The conflict upsets the children, and Ruccharieu tries to calm the tension.
She's happy. Well, I know you're happy to see Gorram and me.
Seedsy, what happened?
You're not here to fix anything, remember?
Feeling like outsiders, Gorram turns the situation into a teachable moment for his son, Rook.
Vision isn't the only way to understand things. It can limit how grand your world can be.
Correct.
Elsewhere in Ravenscross, are the other siblings finding conflict of their own? Chapter 6, Manifest Sight, next time on Across the Sun. Across the Sun Episode 1 was voiced by Danielle Bouchard as Kliyd and Copperwolf, Julia Boudreau as Niwa, Julie Dalpy as Saba, Aaron Martin Colby as Gorram, Jason Pagano as Ruccharieu, Daniel Neal as Azaka, Bill Robinson as Aeden. Additional voices provided by James Stacy, Holly Braga, and Patricia Cousineau. Narrated by, edited, scored, mixed, and mastered by Thomas Wells. Some sound effects and music acquired from Zapsplat.com.